Hello, this is Cameron, and welcome to another video by the Lab Maniacs. As always, we have all deck lists from this video listed in the description below, as well as our social media info. Thank you for watching, and enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to another Laboratory Maniacs Deck Tech. This week I am joined by Sigi, who has finally scored himself a win with the Chain Veil Teferi list that he's already written a primer for, maybe a little prematurely. So Sigi, welcome.
Thanks, and hello everyone.
So tell us a bit about your commander.
Yeah, my commander is Teferi, Temporal Archmage, one of the very few commander-legal planeswalkers that can be used as commanders. He costs 6 mana, 2 of which are blue, and he's got 3 abilities. He can +1 to look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, and the other on the bottom of your library. He can -1 to untap 4 target permanents, which is quite important to the deck's whole strategy. And his ultimate is that you get an emblem with you may activate loyalty abilities of planeswalkers you control during any player's turn at any time you could cast an instant.
Interesting. Those first two definitely sound pretty cool. You have a +1 that draws cards but circumvents Leovold. You have a -1 or minus whatever that breaks parity for you. So is this deck seeking to actively play with your commander?
Yes, absolutely. Pretty much everything we do with Teferi as the deck revolves around playing with your commander. So the main win in this deck is via the Chain Veil, which we can use together with Teferi's -1 to make infinite mana and draw a whole deck even multiple times if we so desire.
Do you want to walk us through how that process works?
Sure, we can do that. So, the Chain Veil is a 4 mana artifact where you can pay 4 and tap it to activate a Planeswalker ability of a Planeswalker as if it hadn't been activated before this turn. So basically, every time you tap the Chain Veil, you are allowed to activate one of your Planeswalkers once more. Thanks to Teferi's -1 ability, we can untap the Chain Veil and keep doing that while Teferi ticks down. And we can also untap a bunch of mana rocks at the same time, allowing us to make enough mana to recast Teferi. And the important part here is that if Teferi then re-enters the battlefield, he can already activate as many abilities as Chain Veil has been activated, plus the usual 1, of course. So let's say, for instance, if your Teferi starts at 5 and goes down all the way to 0 while activating the Chain Veil 5 times, then you can bring him back and immediately activate it 5 times again to either make way more mana or use his +1 and then go from there and so on and so forth.
Interesting. Okay. That makes sense. So the Chain Veil lets new entities, as defined by the rules of Magic, still use those activations. So even though that Teferi wasn't in play when you activated the Chain Veil, you still see all those previous activations.
Yes, exactly. To make it a bit easier to understand, you can basically think of it this way. The Chain Veil activations kind of stick to your turn in a way, rather than a specific Planeswalker entity.
That is a very good and useful way of phrasing that. I know I've struggled to understand how the deck really finishes with that combination in the past, so that's a good description of it. So if maybe Teferi's not sticking, or if there's like a Pithing Needle out or something, do you have any other outs if you just cannot get Teferi to activate?
Sure. So let's assume that going off with Teferi and the Chain Veil is just impossible in this game. Another way we can win is by gaining infinite mana through, for example, Rings of Brighthearth and Basalt Monolith, or one of the monoliths and Power Artifact. And once we've got infinite colorless mana, we can use Rings of Brighthearth and Sensei's Divining Top to basically draw our whole deck. Once we've got our deck in our hand, the usual way that we can win involves casting Stroke of Genius on our opponents, then casting Time Twister, drawing our deck again, casting another Stroke of Genius, and so on until people are dead.
Kludgy, but, that sounds pretty solid.
Yeah, Teferi is the kind of deck that just really goes mainly all in on its main win condition, that being the Chain Veil, since, we basically have one part of the combo in our command zone, and having to do it the backup way usually tends to be a bit uncomfortable.
That makes sense. So, how do you navigate to that win condition, specifically at least the Chain Veil combo with Teferi?
This is where the deck gets really interesting, because Teferi is not like other competitive EDH decks, where you just try to do one particular thing as quickly or efficiently as possible, but rather you can either go for a fast combo win, similar to how, other fast combo decks win the game by just having a bunch of mana, finding the Chain Veil, casting Chain Veil and Teferi, and winning as quickly as possible. Or you can play a long, drawn-out, grindy game where you try to, say, drop a stasis along with Teferi to lock everyone out except for yourself while you slowly and surely draw into your win condition.
Sounds different, let's say.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
How do you decide how you're going to go about a game? Is it based on your opponents? Is it based on your hand? Is it some of both?
Yeah, it's both, in fact. So the first and probably biggest factor is, of course, the opening hand. Now, there are a lot of different opening hands in Teferi. We've got hands that, say, are kind of slow but have a lot of interaction. We've got hands that are very fast but don't really have a lot of payoff, and so on and so forth. And one of the ways in which we can decide on what kind of game to play via our opening hand would be to look at the specific payoffs there. So if we have a payoff and an easy way to reach it, for example, say casting a Transmute artifact on turn 2 or 3, then we can probably try to go for a fast combo route. If we do not have this kind of big payoff, but rather, say, a couple of stacks pieces that are good against the table, or a bigger draw spell that will probably draw us into something else that can win us the game down the line, then we might probably want to go for more of a slow, controlling game.
That makes sense. It's interesting. And I think we're probably going to talk about some examples of those opening hands later.
But yeah, absolutely.
For now, so you talk about how you want to analyze the table before you really decide what route to go down if you're presented with options. How do you interact with those decks to allow yourself to execute on those options?
The biggest part here is definitely about choosing your game plan. So if you are sat at a table with mainly decks that try to go off and win early, you are probably going to have to assume a more stacksy or rather controlling role at the table. You can, of course, assume that other people are going to fight each other over who gets to win earlier, who can prevent a win, etc. But you should understand that your role at the table is definitely to stop somebody from going off if nobody else can. And the same is kind of true in a way for sitting at a more grindy table. So if you're in a stacks matchup and things are going really slowly, you should probably be the one asking questions rather than presenting answers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. So as a pseudo stacks mono blue deck, I'm assuming the majority of your interaction when you want to use it is through the use of various stacks permanents or counter spells?
Yes, that's correct. We do have a bunch of, let's say, silver bullets in our deck, like Torpor Orb, Cursed Totem, Grafdigger's Cage, etc., that we can also find with our artifact tutors. And we've, of course, got the things that blue always has, which is bounce and counter spells. Outside of that, we also have ways to control the whole table with cards like Stasis, which I mentioned earlier, Static Orb, Winter Orb, all of that kind of stuff.
I know from experience playing under those can be a bit difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So what does your deck do better than similar decks?
Funny you'd say that. I think there aren't really any decks that are similar to Teferi in competitive EDH right now. It assumes a very, let's say, decidedly non-specific role in the meta, where, as I said earlier, you can play either the long game or the short game. You can adjust almost anything you do in the deck to your table. And not in the sense that, say, a stacks deck would adjust to the table where they drop specific pieces of hate to slow down strategies that they struggle playing against, but rather you can build your whole game plan around which people you're playing against and what the cards you get look like. And that's, I think, something that is really unique to Teferi. I don't think any other deck can adjust its game plan quite as much.
That makes sense. So if you consider that one of the deck's greatest strengths, what would you say are some of the deck's biggest weaknesses?
Null Rod. It's such a pain, honestly. I mean, if I have a counter or a bounce spell for it, sure, that's good, but Null Rod basically shuts off like 2/3 of our access to mana, and that is a huge problem.
I can see how that would be an issue.
Yeah, another big issue are taxing effects. So Grand Arbiter, Thalia, Thorn of Amethyst, Spear of Resistance, all of those make going off with Teferi quite uncomfortable, because as I said earlier, you need a certain amount of mana to be able to recast Teferi. Since he's not a creature, he of course gets hit by all kinds of stacks effects, and it's much easier to make 8 mana than, say, 10 or 11.
Yeah, because that all has to be between 3 permanents, so...
Pretty much.
You need some real big stuff to be able to pull that off. That makes sense as something the deck would struggle with. So, we've talked a lot about how Teferi plays against other decks. Do you want to draw 3 different opening hands, and we can talk through how you would play those at a given table, how you would play those for a given strategy?
Sure, sounds like a good idea. Let's do that. Alright, after shuffling up for a bit, the first hand I've drawn today is 2 islands, a Mystic Remora, Chain Veil, Impulse, Windfall, and Merchant Scroll. Now this is interesting, quite interesting. I think the main deciding factor about whether I'd keep this hand or not would be my position in the table, actually. Because it's really relying on being able to draw a bunch of cards, mostly mana rocks, off my Mystic Remora. If I am able to do that, say by going first or even going second, then I would probably keep this hand. if I went third or fourth, I'd also have to look around the table. If I wasn't up against, say, Yi-san, maybe like Carador or Selvala, then I wouldn't keep this hand, because Mystic Remora wouldn't be doing a lot, obviously, since it's only for non-creature spells. If I was up against, say, Zer, Jeleva, that kind of stuff, then I'd probably keep this even if I were going third or last.
Interesting. Yeah, Mr. Kimura is definitely a powerhouse, but sometimes it just is not going to do anything for you.
Yeah. Other, let's say, interesting parts about this hand are Merchant Scroll, which obviously lets us get basically anything we might want. A counter spell if we need it to protect our win, or a bounce spell if somebody resolves, say, a Null Rod. All of that kind of good stuff. Windfall is nice because it helps us refuel after we drop all of the stuff we draw off Mystic Remora. Impulse is always nice because it's fairly mana efficient for how many cards it sees, and having Chain Veil in your opening hand is usually great, but it kind of needs the mana rocks to go along with it, which is why Mystic Remora is going to be crucial for this hand.
So potentially risky, but with a lot of possible upside.
Absolutely.
So you would keep this hand based on several factors.
Yeah.
Nice.
I think I like this hand. I'd probably keep it most of the time.
I do tend to like a turn 1 Mystic Remora, almost exclusively of who I'm up against.
Yeah, it is really
almost.
Good.
Yeah.
All right.
So how about the second hand?
Second hand, I guess we have to talk about it. It's not great. Not great at all. Really not what we want to see here. So the first thing of note is that the lands in this hand are quite eccentric, to say the least. We've got one island, an Academy Ruins, and a Mishra's Workshop. Sounds decent, but not when we see the rest of the hand, which is a High Tide, a Stroke of Genius, a Time Spiral, and a Winter Orb. Yep.
That is a special hand.
Yeah, I would probably not even think about playing this hand at all. I'd probably just ship it back because nothing in this hand really works together, and dropping a turn 1 Winter Orb is not amazing.
Especially not when your powerhouse follow-up is going to be do nothing.
Yes.
That's not a good spot to be in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this hand is unplayable. Not something I ever want to see. So,
cool. Well, then let's leave it alone.
Yes, please. Alright, should we go to our third hand?
Yeah, let's see what you got.
Alright, number 3 is definitely an interesting one. So we've got Ancient Tomb, Scalding Tarn, Expedition Map, Overburden, Thran Dynamo, Thirst for Knowledge, and Frantic Search.
I like that a lot.
So do I. It's a nice hand. So this has a lot going for it. Overburden, of course, is amazing in all of the creature-based matchups against decks like Edric, Carador, Yi-san, Selvala, and so on. Expedition Map is quite good because it lets us find the type of land we need, and we'll probably have the mana available to make use of it, so we can get Tabernacle if we need even more creature hate. We can get Workshop if we draw a bunch of artifacts off our draw spells. Yeah, all around, really, really nice. Frantic Search and Thirst for Knowledge are 2 of the better draw spells in our deck, so those will help us dig deeper early to find even more mana rocks than just the Thran Dynamo. But even if we just find a land or something, we've basically got the Chain Veil combo set up, ready to go on turn 3 with a Thran Dynamo in play, and the ability to make a bunch of mana.
That is a pretty good hand, I'd say.
Yeah, the only issue with it is that we don't have a lot of interaction, no counter spells, no bounce. but that can probably be offset if we need it by using our draw spells.
Yeah, and even if you don't necessarily have interaction in your hand, the expedition map is potentially either interaction or increased velocity, depending on what you need.
That is correct.
I like it. I think that's a pretty good hand.
Yeah, I'd probably keep it against most tables.
Cool. Well, Sigi, thank you for joining me and talking all about your Chainveil Teferi deck. Obviously, this is only a deck tech, so we can't cover everything in depth that we would like to. But if you're interested in learning more about the Chainveil Teferi deck, Sigi and Neosloth both have a primer that they've co-written on tappedout.com. You can find that primer through our subreddit's primers link, and I highly recommend it. I think it's one of the best written primers for a competitive EDH deck that I've ever read. So if you're interested in the deck, or even if you're just interested in learning how to play against it, if someone in your meta has been picking it up, I highly recommend taking a look at that primer to learn more about how the deck functions and how you can actually disrupt it. Thank you again, Sigi, and this has been another Lab Maniacs Deck Tech. We will see you next time.
Thank you, and goodbye.